As progressives, we are committed to making our democracy work, repairing the places it's fractured, strengthening the places it's vulnerable, and defending the places it's effective. In April, the Congressional Progressive Caucus released our platform for 2025. In it, we outlined the work we're committed to ensuring our democracy is strong. Today, I have the honor to stand with a number of my colleagues who've been the movers and shakers in protecting our democracy, in working towards strengthening our democracy, in helping expand our democracy. And so I am pleased as we get started with our special order hour to yield to my colleagues who will share their progress, the progress that they have made, and what Congress must still accomplish to further deliver on the work their communities sent them here to do. I would like to start by yielding to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
I want to thank the gentlelady for yielding and for organizing us in this special order hour on the most important problem of our time, which is democracy. Will we have democracy, or will we lapse into some other form of government like autocracy or theocracy or plutocracy? So I want to thank Ms. Ramirez for her leadership, and thank you for leading us in that beautiful and moving moment of silence for the victims of the terrorist attack on our country on 9/11. So a true Republican president, the founder of the Republican Party, spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that's been the beautiful, tantalizing vision of America, but we can't say that's how America began. We began as a slave republic of white male property owners over the age of 21 years old. But it has been through successive waves of popular, political, social struggle and constitutional amendment that we've opened America up and come much closer to forming a more perfect union and reaching the ideal that President Lincoln proclaimed from the battlefield of Gettysburg in 1863. Still today, there are people who say on this floor, they will come to the floor, Mr. Speaker, and they say, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And they think that they've struck some kind of knockout blow against the overwhelming sentiment of the American people, including President Reagan, who gave a great speech in Europe about American democracy, and never once used the word republic, but constantly invoked democracy. And yet there are people who say, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Well, what's a republic? A republic is just a representative democracy, because you can't fit 300 million people in the U.S. House of Representatives or in a school board meeting. So we use Republican institutions in order to have the democratic will expressed. And if you read the Constitution the way I read the Constitution, the whole trajectory of American historical and constitutional development has been towards greater democracy, right? If you look at the amendments we've had since the original Bill of Rights, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave us equal protection and due process. The 15th Amendment said no race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifted the mode of election of U.S. senators from the legislatures to the people. The 19th Amendment doubled the franchise in America by giving women the right to vote and establishing their political equality in the country. The 23rd Amendment gave people in Washington, D.C. at least the right to vote for president of the United States, although not voting representation. The 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. So the whole movement of our history has been towards incorporating, encompassing, and including people who had been formerly disenfranchised, marginalized, and excluded from equal political participation. It's been a seesaw struggle throughout our history. There have been always people who've wanted to revoke other people's voting rights, undermine other people's voting rights, disenfranchise them, strip away their ability to register to vote. Tocqueville said in Democracy in America that he observed that democracy and voting rights in our country are either shrinking and shriveling away, or they're growing and expanding. And I want to thank the Progressive Caucus for this session, because we've got to get democracy back on the growth track in America. We've got to get away from all of the voter suppression and interference tactics that we've seen grow up, at least since 2013, when the Supreme Court rendered its dreadful decision in Shelby County versus Holder, essentially decapitating the Voting Rights Act, knocking out the pre-clearance requirement for covered jurisdictions, saying that no longer did they have to submit voting changes to the Department of Justice or to a federal district court before they could implement those voting changes. We have since seen more than 100 voter laws pass all over the country, around a half of them in the original covered jurisdictions under the Voting Rights Act. We've seen new obstacles to voter registration. We've seen massive closure of precinct voting places, mergers of different precinct voting places. I just got back from Texas, where a group of students came to see me from the University of Texas to say this is going on there right now, where the governor has closed down a polling place and then relocated one in Austin on the campus of the University of Texas, away from a well-traveled thoroughfare, a big, bright building, to putting it in the basement somewhere else on campus. But these kinds of tactics are used all over the country in order to suppress the vote. So we need to be moving forward in terms of voting rights, and I'm very eager to hear what my colleagues have to say about that. I just want to point a couple things out. We're in 2024. This is the 21st century. It is time for us to be electing the President of the United States the way we elect governors, representatives, senators, mayors, everybody else. Whoever gets the most votes wins. We've had 5 popular vote losers become president twice in this century, in 2000 and 2016, under the creaky, antiquated, and obsolete mechanisms of the Electoral College, which is so subject to fraud and manipulation. And as we saw in this very chamber, the Electoral College can get you killed in the 21st century, because it offers more opportunities to strategic bad faith actors like former President Donald Trump to try to revisit a result and reopen a result in an election. So we need to be moving forward to a national popular vote for election. We spend tens of millions of dollars a year all over the world teaching people about democracy, and the one thing they never come back to us with when they're writing a new constitution is the idea that, oh, you know that Electoral College thing you have? We think we'll import that to our country. We never hear that, right? So we should be able to learn from our own experience and from the experience of democracies around the world. And another important ingredient to democracy is statehood. That's how communities that have been formerly disenfranchised and subordinated have been able to lift themselves up. We are in the nation's capital, which is the only nation's capital on the planet Earth, which is not represented in their own national legislature. 713,000 tax-paying, draftable U.S. citizens are completely disenfranchised in the House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate. They don't have representation. If you told the people of Paris they could not be represented in l'Assemblée nationale because they breathe the same air that other people's representatives breathe, you would have another French Revolution on your hands. And when we passed in the 117th Congress the D.C. statehood legislation, and I was one of the floor leaders for that, I had the honor of telling the people of Washington, D.C. this: thank you for having a bona fide, real political grievance and not coming down here and beating the daylights out of our police officers the way that the MAGA mob did when Donald Trump falsely convinced them that they had won the presidential election, which Trump had lost, by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. No, they didn't come down and storm the chamber and try to overthrow the Constitution. They did it the right way. They had a statehood constitutional convention. They're asking for admission. We should admit the people of Washington, D.C. as an equal state into the Union using our powers under Article 4 of the Constitution. It's the same thing with 3.5 million American citizens in Puerto Rico. They should be given the opportunity to become a state as well. So we've got to keep the trajectory of democracy moving forward so we don't lapse into some other form of government. And this has been a tough time with challenges to the basic constitutional structure, presidential candidates saying, just set the Constitution aside. We saw a violent insurrection supporting a political coup in this very chamber. That is the alternative to moving forward with everything that we're going to be talking about tonight in terms of improving representation through ranked choice voting, in terms of campaign finance reform so we don't have money drowning out the voice of the people, filibuster reform, ethics reform at the Supreme Court. All of those things are essential, and we need the momentum of a pro-democracy movement to keep us from becoming like Vladimir Putin's country or Viktor Orban's country, any of those close buddies of Donald Trump that he invoked in the presidential debate last night, that he conscripted as character witnesses for him in this election. So we've got a very clear choice for America moving forward. I want to thank the Progressive Caucus for offering so much leadership. And we know that it's tough and it's a struggle. Frederick Douglass from my state said that if there's no struggle, there's no progress. The struggle may be moral, it may be physical, it may be moral and physical, but there must be struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And, you know, John Dewey said that, that there are no ills to democracy that cannot be solved without more democracy. Democracy is the corrective to the impediments to democracy. And what we're suffering from today is the obstacles and the impediments to democracy. But we've got the means and we've got the will in the country to move forward. And I thank you for giving me this opportunity, Ms. Ramirez, and I yield back to you.
Thank you, Congressman Raskin. And you're absolutely right. We are committed to progress. We are committed to moving forward. We're committed to strengthening our voting rights. We're committed to improving representation. We're committed to campaign finance reform. We're committed to fully funded federal agencies. And we're committed to ethics, courts, and filibuster reform. There is someone who has been doing this work for a very long time and has developed the leadership among other members to continue this work even after he leaves this chamber. I want to yield to the gentleman, another gentleman from Maryland, a friend, someone that I am inspired by, and I am committed to make sure that we carry on this legacy of progress. I'm yielding to Mr. Sarbanes from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Representative Ramirez. I want to salute the Congressional Progressive Caucus for pulling together this special order to talk about the importance of strengthening our democracy. You were absolutely right to begin the discussion tonight by reminding us that this is the anniversary of September 11th, the tragedy that struck our country. This is a day when, as patriots, we stand up as Americans. We salute the flag, we salute our history. So it's very appropriate that it's a day on which we want to speak to the need to strengthen and deepen our resolve when it comes to making sure the democracy of this country, that connective tissue, is as strong as it can possibly be. The sad reality is that over a period of years now, many Americans have become more cynical because they look at Washington, they look at the places where laws are made, and they feel that it's more distant from them, that it doesn't fully express their voice, their dreams, their hopes and aspirations. And a lot of that has to do, as you know, with throwing obstacles in the way of voters as they try to access the ballot box, or making it difficult for their priorities to be carried forward because of the insidious influence of dark money and other forces that are behind the curtain. So we have applied ourselves over a period of many Congresses now to try to channel the grievances that our constituents have expressed into pieces of legislation that can begin over time, if we can get them passed, to restore that fundamental faith in democracy. These include the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore the protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. By the way, a piece of legislation that at every opportunity for reauthorization until very recently was supported in a bipartisan fashion. Republicans and Democrats understood that you needed to have these voting protections in place. Unfortunately, over the last few years, for reasons difficult to discern sometimes, our Republican colleagues have fallen away from this commitment, and we've had to carry it ourselves. So that's one important piece of legislation that Democrats are supporting, that repeatedly we've brought to the floor of this House and we've passed here. It's been a more difficult prospect on the Senate side, but we have the hope that that opportunity will present itself as well. Another critical piece of legislation that I've felt privileged to have carried and exercised some leadership on is the Freedom to Vote Act. It started out as the For the People Act. It has evolved over a period of 2 or 3 Congresses. We've passed it 4 or 5 different times out of this chamber, again running into the blockade on the Senate side. But this is a bill where every provision of it is designed to respond to that cynicism that Americans are feeling. The first 300 pages of the Freedom to Vote Act were authored by our late colleague, John Lewis, the freedom fighter who inspired so many of us before he came to Congress and during his time in Congress. But he understood that we had to make it possible for people to access the ballot box without having to run an obstacle course every 2 years. Put in place these fundamental reforms that every American in every community can benefit from. Automatic voter registration, same-day registration, early voting, mail balloting, all the things that make it possible when somebody gets up on the morning of that day when they've decided to cast their vote and know that that's not going to be a difficult transaction, that they can do that they can access their democracy in a straightforward way. So that's one centerpiece of the Freedom to Vote Act. Another grievance we heard from Americans for many, many years is, why should politicians be able to choose their voters instead of the other way around? And we've seen what extreme partisan gerrymandering has done across the country. It means that in the House of Representatives, we don't actually have a fair representation of what the vote is out in the country. And this makes average people out there feel disrespected. Voters feel like their voice is not being given the weight and the due that it deserves. So included within the Freedom to Vote Act are provisions that would establish an objective, independent way of determining how districts should be drawn so that we are respectful of the voters. Another key piece of this reform package. And then the last critical dimension of this is what to do about the undue influence, the sinister, insidious influence that money has over the political system. Your voice consists of 2 basic components in a democracy. One is that you can cast your vote freely and fairly. But the other dimension of it is if you send people to Washington, if you elect them, if you pull the lever for them, your expectation is when they get there, they will fight for your priorities and they won't get hijacked or captured by special interests and big money. The reality is very different, unfortunately, and it leaves people feeling disempowered. So two key reforms that are included within this legislation are the Disclose Act, which would require that we have transparency in terms of this dark money that is flooded onto our system. And another piece that I know you feel very passionately about, Representative Ramirez, and that is a small donor matching system that can support candidates' efforts to get out there and run their campaigns, free from dependence on big money and deep pockets. And this legislation would create a system where for every dollar you raise from small donations, grassroots donations, you get a 6-to-1 match from something we call the Freedom from Influence Fund. And by the way, that fund would not be taxpayer underwritten. We would put a small surcharge on government settlements with big corporate lawbreakers and high-end tax cheats. That would go into a special fund, and that would underwrite the matching funds to come in to support these candidates. And what I like about that is the people that are leaning on our democracy and trying to break it, they're going to have to pay to create a system that can lift our democracy up. So all of these things are designed to respond to those grievances that Americans feel. And these key pieces of legislation, John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, the Native American Voting Rights Act, the D.C. Statehood Bill, they're very simple in what they're trying to achieve. Give a voice to all Americans. Thank you to the Progressive Caucus for pulling us together this evening, and I yield my time back to you.
Thank you, Congressman Sarbanes, and you couldn't have said it more perfectly as we were wrapping up here. You know, I often ask myself, what would it look like if money didn't determine elections, if qualifications did, if competency would? What would it look like if we got big money out of politics, which is exactly what we should all be prioritizing. I don't think anyone can speak better about that issue than my colleague, the gentleman from New York, and I would like to yield to Congressman Bowman from New York.
Thank you so much, Representative Ramirez, for your leadership. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this really important discussion. Thank you for bringing this issue to the forefront of the American people. You know, there are many who believe we no longer have a democracy. There are many who believe our country is controlled by an oligarchy. Many believe our country is controlled by a few wealthy Americans who act as puppet masters over members of Congress and who act as puppet masters over elected officials across the country. We are not engaging in the arena of new ideas. We are not engaging in the arena of shared values. We take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution against enemies foreign and domestic. But if we allow people with wealth to undermine our Constitution, we are not doing our job. And so, yes, I can speak personally to this issue because in my primary race, I had special interest groups spend more money against me in my primary than has been spent against any member of Congress in United States history. They were bombarding, my district was bombarded with advertisements, with mailers, with misinformation and disinformation, and ideas and policies that didn't reflect the values that was behind the big money that was being poured in. And what made it worse, Representative Ramirez, is a lot of this big money came from unknown sources because of Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United. We don't have to publicly know where these dollars are coming from as we engage with super PACs. And so we absolutely need democracy reform, and it starts with getting big money out of politics. One important way to do that is to overturn Citizens United. We must overturn Citizens United. If you want to support a candidate, your name must be public, period. But not only that, if you believe those who say, and I do, that our democracy is no longer a democracy because it's controlled by an oligarchy, the wealthy elite, we have to look at the outcomes that our democracy is currently producing. Why don't we have universal health care? Why don't we have fully funded public schools? Why don't we have paid leave for all? Why don't we have a Green New Deal? Why does 1 in 5 children go to bed hungry in our country? Why do we have consistent economic and wealth inequality? I would argue it's because those in the oligarchy class want things to remain that way. And as a result, members of this body continue to vote in favor of special interests. I mean, Representative Ramirez, we couldn't even raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour. If you grow up or live in a red line community, redlined by American politicians in this body, your schools are less funded than wealthier communities. And so a strong, vibrant, healthy democracy must include every single person in our country voting in every election. But they are being disenfranchised by the big money, and they have lost hope because of the big money. So Representative Ramirez, again, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for allowing me to say a few words. In order for our democracy to be as strong as ever, both on the domestic front, but also supporting democracies around the world, we have to get big money out of politics. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Bowman, and I am committed to working with you here and out of here to ensure that happens. Folks, when we talk about the issues that matter most, as Congressman Bowman mentioned, everything from housing to healthcare to education, we understand that when democracy is weakened, our ability to move reforms under these issues or because of these issues is also impacted. I would like to yield to someone who I've had the opportunity to serve with for the last 21 months, a fierce advocate for our communities, not just in Vermont, but all over, making sure that justice, equity, strengthening democracy is at the forefront. And so I'd like to yield to the gentlewoman from Vermont, Congresswoman Ballant.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Ramirez. It is an honor to serve with you and to speak here tonight about an issue that is incredibly important to me, and that is the health and strength of the democracy. When I ran for Congress, the issue I heard the most about was just that, the health and the strength of the democracy. Yes, of course, Vermonters cared about particular issues to our district, housing, workforce crisis, the mental health crisis, all of these things, but they said more than anything, I'm worried about the health of the democracy. And I came to the job having come up through the Vermont State Senate, and before that I was a teacher and tried to instill in my students the importance of being involved in the democracy to keep replenishing it with the energy and the attention it requires. And what I've noticed over the last few years, there is indeed a cynicism creeping in, as my colleague mentioned earlier. And cynicism has a corrosive effect not just on the democracy, but on our own health and stability and the health of our communities. But it is, in fact, the voice of the status quo. It is about convincing people that you can't actually make change, so why even try? That it's futile. And the stakes are so incredibly high. I will tell you, my family knows firsthand that democracies don't fail overnight. My grandfather was killed in the Holocaust, and I grew up with the understanding that people can be horribly cruel to one another and can perpetuate horrors upon individuals and families when the law does not protect the most vulnerable, and when people turn away from each other and demonize each other. And I can tell you, in earnest, we have seen this in this country in the last few years. Has grown to a fever pitch of dehumanizing and demonizing our fellow Americans. And I see it in my committees, whether it is attacking immigrants or migrants, or attacking the LGBTQ community, or attacking the poor. It is not about coming together as an American and finding common cause with other Americans. It's often about making people the scapegoats. And democracies fail little by little as our rights are stripped away from us, as democratic norms are upended, as people are scapegoated. And my parents never took for granted the rights and privileges provided to us by the U.S. Constitution, and that we must be vigilant and take our responsibility of supporting and protecting the Constitution seriously. Now, I was very concerned when I started almost 2 years ago now, coming up on 2 years, when I started in Congress, because I knew that 139 members of this body did not vote to certify a free and fair election. Of those 139, 124 ran for re-election, and 118 are still serving in Congress, who serve with us in committees, who we have to see on the floor, people who did not support the free and fair election and the peaceful transfer of power. This sickens me. In moments when I am home in Vermont, it's very difficult to convey to my constituents what it feels like sometimes to be here as a public servant, supporting the democracy, supporting the ideals that supposedly we all hold so dear, and to serve alongside people who still will not admit that Joe Biden is the rightful winner of the 2020 election. It should outrage all of us. How can we make the case to our children, to my former students, that democracy is something to protect, that's something that is sacred, that we all have a stake in making sure it is healthy, when there are members of Congress who still will not admit that Joe Biden is the rightful winner of the 2020 election? We must commit, all of us, to rising above this dangerous nonsense, because we all know the truth. We do. We know the truth. And as we head into another election season, I know what I fear. I fear that once again, we will be faced with a critical moment of courage, and that some will fail that test. So when I heard that the topic tonight was about strengthening the democracy, I said, absolutely, I will be there. Because none of these things, strengthening our voting rights, improving our representation, making sure that we have campaign finance reform, and supporting our communities, nothing can happen if we do not have a commitment to the people in this chamber to admit the rightful winner of an election and to stand in this chamber and certify those election results. I look forward to seeing some courage, regardless of the outcome. I hope that I am not once again deeply, deeply disappointed and disgusted by the lack of courage and fortitude of those who say that they support the Constitution and the rule of law and this great democracy. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Balint. Your words could not have been more powerful. Folks, we are at a crossroads right now. And the Congressional Progressive Caucus is committed to strengthening voting rights. Because we know, and our caucus wants to make sure that we protect the right to vote by passing broad and comprehensive voting rights bills that eliminates barriers to voting for U.S. citizens. We want same-day automatic and online voter registration. We're committed to improving representation because we're the party that wants to abolish the Electoral College, grant statehood to the District of Columbia, and establish a democratic process for the people of Puerto Rico to determine the island's future political status. We are committed to bold campaign finance reform. We are the party that wants to end corruption and get big money and corporations out of politics by finally eliminating dark money in elections. We are committed to fully funding federal agencies that invest in Americans' health, education, and well-being. And we are the party that wants to ensure that Congress funds vital federal agencies and prevents the privatization of government services. We are committed to reforming the filibuster. And we are the party that wants to allow for the democratic consideration and passage of essential legislation. We are committed to ethics reform. We are the caucus that wants to ban stock trading and ownership for members of Congress and the federal judiciary and impose an enforceable code of conduct on the Supreme Court, including instituting accountability measures and restrictions on gifts and requiring judicial disclosures and recusal. We are committed to reforming the court. We are the party that wants to expand the number of justices on the bench, implement term limits, and create new judgeships across the federal system. And folks, as you heard from my colleagues here, we are committed because it's important to remember that this week, extreme Republicans are attempting to hold the government hostage so they can advance a bill that creates barriers to voting for U.S. citizens. Bottom line, it is already illegal under current law for non-citizens to register to vote or to vote in federal elections. And despite numerous recounts, challenges in court, and the deep dives by conservative think tanks, there has been zero evidence of widespread voter fraud. Folks, it's a scare tactic. And extreme Republicans are trying to scare Americans, the fear-mongering, into giving up the right to exercise their vote in an accessible and unburdensome election process. The SAVE Act is voter suppression, plain and simple, requiring citizens to show documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. places an extreme burden on countless Americans, including military voters, Native voters, people who have changed their names, including tens of million American women, the elderly, the young, the poor, and naturalized citizens. The SAVE Act's burdens on rightful voters are extreme because most Americans would be unable to register to vote using their driver's license or other state-provided identification alone. Even real IDs do not meet the SAVE Act's requirement. Millions of Americans, including tens of thousands in each congressional district, would be prevented from registering to vote easily, if at all. Americans would not be able to use military IDs or tribal IDs alone when registering to vote. U.S. citizens who are putting their life on the line would have to go get a passport and other documents to prove their citizenship. People who have changed their names, including millions of married women who would not be allowed to use their birth certificates when proving their citizenship. Registration applications would need to be presented in person, essentially ending mail-in voting and creating barriers for same-day voter registration. The SAVE Act makes it clear exactly who extreme Republicans believe should have an easy time accessing the right to vote, and more importantly, who they believe should have a difficult time. It is in this moment, in this context, that my colleagues and I come to this chamber to convene the special order hour, to make it crystal clear exactly who is committed to doing the work of repairing and strengthening democracy. And repairing and strengthening and protecting our democracy is one of my greatest priorities in Congress. You see, I have the honor of co-chairing the House Task Force on Strengthening Democracy, where I meet with my colleagues to discuss legislative solutions to act on Americans' desire to fortify the basic building blocks of healthy democracy. And during the August recess, I launched my democracy working groups in Chicago and DuPage County. I convened constituents and grassroots leaders and organizations to share what they have seen, what they've learned, and what they have felt as they do the work on the ground of building democracy that works for everyone. I hosted a teletown hall focused on making government work for Illinois 3, and a Wheaton town hall focused on the topic of defending democracy. You see, listening to the voices of our communities and ensuring those voices are heard and valued is part of our democracy and is what's most important. What we've learned and affirmed is that democracy is a work in progress. It's not perfect by any means. We have heard that we cannot simply strengthen democracy, simply preserve democracy. We must repair it and expand it where it's not living up to its potential. We need democracy that truly works for the people, where government is responsive to the needs of its citizens, where we keep big money out of politics, ethics reform both in our Supreme Court and presidency, protecting our election workers and our right to vote, defending public institutions from privatization and elimination. And that's why I'm so proud to co-sponsor numerous substantial pieces of legislation across the broad aspects of democracy and good governance, including bills like the Freedom to Vote Act by Congressman Sarbanes and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act by Congressman Sewell, which must be among the first bills we take on in the 119th Congress. And as I wrap up in a few minutes our special order hour, I do want to talk about some of the movers and shakers that are helping do this work, repair, strengthen, and protect our democracy. And to do so, I want to start by recognizing an organization that serves the state of Illinois, led by one of my constituents, Mary Ellen Daniels. And she's improving access to information, amplifying the voices of young people, and breaking down barriers to their participation. Illinois Democracy Schools Network is a vital initiative committed to educating the next generation about the civic process. The growing network of middle and high schools is dedicated to expanding civic learning opportunities across Illinois, particularly in schools serving students of color, to ensure all students are prepared to meaningfully participate in public life. By creating high-quality learning experiences, the Democracy Schools Network helps foster, inform, activate, and provide equitable civic engagement among young people. On behalf of Illinois' 3rd Congressional District, I do want to thank the Illinois Democracy Schools Network for nurturing the foundations of our democracy. And folks, free and fair elections are the cornerstone of our democracy. And it's why I co-sponsored and co-sponsoring several pieces of legislation that protects and expands ballot access, as we just talked about. But I do want to go into H.R. 11 a little deeper. Expanding voter registration and voting access prohibits voting roll removal, establishes Election Day as a federal holiday, and enacts other voting rights and election reforms. H.R. 14, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, strengthens voting rights by expanding and strengthening government's ability to respond to voting discrimination. Defending the right to vote is defending our communities. Let me say that again. Defending the right to vote is defending our communities. And so I will continue resisting and challenging any attempt from extremists in our government to undermine our democracy and erode our rights. We all have a role to play to get engaged, to register people to vote, to serve as election judges, to combat misinformation, and we have to fight for the democracy that we deserve. And there's an organization that's been doing this work around the clock, defending democracy, and that is Midwest Voting Rights Program of the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. This vital initiative focuses on ensuring fair access to the vote and upholding election laws. Through their election protection program and litigation, they provide critical resources on Election Day. They partner with incarcerated and returning community members to expand voting rights. They ensure racial equity in redistricting, and they defend civil rights and advocate for equitable election laws in Illinois and Indiana. A notable leader in this work is Clifford Helm, Senior Counsel for the program and a proud constituent of Illinois' 3rd Congressional District. Thank you, Clifford and Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, for your dedication to eliminating barriers to voting and enhancing civic participation, especially in marginalized communities. We also need organizations that create and provide citizen tools to hold our officials accountable. And that's why I'm proud to recognize Indivisible, a grassroots movement dedicated to strengthening our democracy through education and civic engagement. Through Indivisible Civics, they provide invaluable resources, training, and tools to empower local groups and activists, including to engage with their local elected officials and hold them accountable. Since the beginning of 2019, Indivisible members have made 73,625 calls to Congress and have organized over 2,000 grassroots events in all 50 states. And their focus is civic knowledge and skills that help individuals become effective advocates and informed citizens. In Illinois' 3rd Congressional District, active Indivisible chapters in Illinois, and civic leaders like Diane McGuire, Deborah McCoy, Kathy Tholen, Jerry Can, Patricia Graham, Denise Polak, they're working tirelessly to engage their neighbors in the civic process. And I want to thank Invisible for their commitment to fostering a well-informed electorate and a stronger democracy. And folks, while extreme Republicans demonstrate which Americans they believe should have access to vote and who they believe shouldn't, I am honored to recognize the nonprofit Chicago Votes for their efforts in fostering civic engagement among the next generation of leaders in our city. Their Unlock Civics program works to increase democratic participation from justice-impacted adults, from registering over 5,000 voters in Cook County Jail to advocating for legislation to make the jail the first in the nation to serve as a primary election voting location. Chicago Votes also works to engage young people in local civic processes, from the regular parade to the polls, to creating nonpartisan voting guides, to supporting educators around civic curriculum. Their fellowship and their leadership development opportunities for youth and justice-impacted individuals, including their Democracy Corps, build stronger leaders for a stronger, more informed democracy. So Chicago Votes, thank you. I also want to acknowledge the work of organizations like the Latino Policy Forum. Latino Policy Forum is doing the work to protect our multicultural, our multiracial democracy from attempts to scapegoat, silence, criminalize, and persecute our Latino and our immigrant communities. Through their efforts and coalition, the forum has engaged comunidades Latinas in the civic process of our democracy. Whether by expanding participation in census or access to multilingual and culturally competent educational voter material, the organization is fighting to ensure equitable representation and fair investment in our communities. The work has been possible thanks to the efforts of its staff and its president and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum, Silvia Puente, who after 16 years of service announced her well-earned retirement. Her unwavering leadership has been instrumental in driving positive, meaningful change for our communities. And in the face of the cruel policies that are looking to hurt our communities, thank you for inspiring us with your leadership. Gracias por luchar por nuestra comunidad contra viento y marea. And so, as I wrap up here, I want to thank all my colleagues who joined tonight's Progressive Caucus Special Order Hour. And I want to end with this. I am the product of community organizing. I am the product of a movement that continues to fight for what is right, even when the attacks just keep coming, and even in the face of fear, even in the face of loss and hardship. We are and have been a nation at a crossroads. We say we are facing an existential crisis, but the truth is that we've been facing this crisis for a very long time. This country has consistently faced a crossroad: to choose fear or to choose hope, to choose love or to choose hate, to choose bigotry or to choose equity, to choose oppression or to choose justice. We face those all too familiar crossroads again. Will we choose democracy or will we submit to dictatorship? Democracy is a grand experiment of collective experience, and it cannot be taken for granted. It is precious and fragile, and it requires that we strive to be the best of ourselves. And I am encouraged that each time this country faced a crossroads, organizers were there, bending the arc of history towards justice, fighting like hell. We fight like hell for our communities. Our communities have always been at this target of injustice. But we also know that we fight like hell for our children and their future. We fight like hell against Trump and MAGA Republicans and Project 2025 as they are a fundamental threat to our children. The people want big money out of politics. The people want us to reform the Supreme Court. The people want us to protect the integrity of our elections. And our democracy will be repaired, strengthened, and preserved when we fight for democracy. And so, folks, I believe that the people united will never be defeated because we have something to fight for. And I fight for my husband, a dreamer. I fight for my nieces and nephews. I fight for every Latina who aspires to public office. I fight for the movement. And the fight ahead is worth it. So there is no greater honor to fight alongside you to protect, preserve, and expand democracy. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of